Okay, now let's look at the second approach, which is informative prior, because we're going to take into account the results of the first study, which we ignored in approach 1. So that's the reason why we call it informative prior. So like in approach 1, we start out with a prior probability of 1% likelihood of birth defect, 2%, and so on, all the way up to almost close to 1%, which is the same starting point as approach 1. Okay. And we will then take into account the first study. So take each of these prior probabilities and compute the probability of the outcome given in the first study. So for each of the probabilities we assume here in column G22 to G121, we compute what is the probability that there will be 58 adverse outcomes out of 125 for each of those cases. So that would be our revised prior. So that's your prior knowledge. Okay. Now we bring in the second study, again for the same prior probabilities going from 0.01 to almost close to 1 from G22 to G121, we compute the likelihood, which is the same as in approach 1. But the difference is in approach 1, we use these likelihoods as our prior probability, posterior probability, but here what we're going to do in approach 2 is to modify the likelihood that we just computed into the posterior probability by multiplying the revised prior with the likelihood. So that will give us the posterior probability that takes into account the results of the first study. And then we normalize these posterior probabilities. So let's head on over to Excel and set this up. Okay, so we have the proportion that's going to be the same as that. Now, prior knowledge is binom dist, right? The number of success, this is for the first study. So number of success is that, and since we're going to have to copy this down to the other rows, we have to do absolute reference by pressing F4, comma number of trials, F4 again, okay, and then the probability of success, which is that, okay, so that's going to change from row to row, so we leave that without absolute reference, and then we want the actual probability, not cumulative probability. So that's our prior. Now likelihood is again binom dist. Okay, now this time it is the second study. Okay, and F4, comma number of trials F4. Now it's the same proportion. Okay, and then false. Okay. Now the posterior is we take this likelihood and multiply by the revised prior knowledge. Okay, so now we can copy these two. Okay, now we need to normalize, and for that we need the sum of this. All right, and then normalize by taking each probability and dividing by the sum, and that should be absolute referenced. Okay, so then do that. Now let's check. Okay, copy that over. So that's the sum. So now we have normalized this probability. So now we have the posterior probability for each of the prior probability that we start out with. Okay, so we have two sets now, uninformative prior starting out prior probabilities and the estimated probability of birth defect for each of those cases, and with informative prior as well. So we have two sets. So what we will do is we will do simulation. We will use risk general to fit a continuous probability between these two sets of revised probabilities, and then run the simulation.